Make sure you have to hear us now.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us both online and in person today for this discussion of youth expertise. We will start our discussion today with the reason that we are all here, which is to hear about the wonderful work of Dr. Helen Berents. And then we will follow that with our panel discussion, but I will introduce our speakers for that after we've heard from Helen. So Helen Berents is a senior lecturer in the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. She's a feminist scholar, centrally interested in the interconnected areas of the presence and roles of young people in global politics, everyday experiences of conflict and peace building, and local global relations in peace and security governance. She has held an Australian Research Council DECRO Fellowship between the years of 2020 and 2024, and it's this research that she will be presenting on today. The fellowship was hosted by the Griffith Asia Institute, and it examined youth leadership and inclusion in the context of the emergent global youth peace and security agenda. And the symposium that we've been at for 2 days has served as the concluding event to this fellowship. So thank you, Helen Berents, and I look forward to your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'd like to just start with an acknowledgement of the land that we're on. I would like to pay my respects to the elders of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, respect to their elders past and present, and to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. We live and work on stolen lands, and that when we're talking about these things, particularly thinking about, as we've been doing over the last 2 days in the broader symposium, youth futures, that we live in a place with a history that is part of these conversations as well. So Caitlin has very generously introduced me and the project that I've been working on in the last few years. And I have to say, when I put this together and sat down to do the presentation, I was a little bit intimidated by trying to sum up what I've been doing. And of course, as I'm sure many people here and online know, doing justice to the work and the people and the stories and the complexities of what has been shared with me over the last few years. So what I thought I would do is to talk a little bit about the project and what I've done, and talk in particular about the kind of conceptual framing I'm trying to think through to kind of explain the puzzle that's emerged in this work as well. I will also say that I come to this work with over a decade of previous work in the space of youth and peace building, much of it very much in the context of the everyday and the local. And I have a strong conviction in not only the value but the necessity of recognising the capacity, leadership and contributions of young people. Excuse me. And I'm not apologetic about holding this position and it being a normative one. Those, I think, who remain unconvinced of the role of young people's co-constitutive practices in building more peaceful and secure societies at this point can only be ignoring the wealth of evidence that young people provide us, show us in terms of their positive contributions, their leadership and their self-directed achievement. And alongside that, their willingness to navigate multiple intersecting encounters with power, with privilege and with exclusions as well. So for me, the question that remains in my work is how can this action, this positive action by young people be recognised and engaged with in ways that firstly do not reproduce harmful power dynamics or hierarchies that diminish their contributions, and secondly, which do not reify or romanticise youth and their actions in doing that work. So as I said, I can't possibly talk about everything today. So as I said, I'm going to give you an overview of the puzzle and then talk about how I'm kind of conceptualizing it. And this puzzle, as I'll discuss, is centered around the idea of expertise and how we recognize young people as experts or not. So I wanted to start with a story. So this, as always, sorry, I should say also, the stories I share either have names used with permission or descriptors to identify them in terms of where they come from or what else it might be. So here, let me read this to you. So this is a 29-year-old young woman, comes from Latin America, and she's telling me about an encounter she had. She said, I travelled as an assistant for the Coalition about children affected by armed conflict, and we came with this report to the UN, which was super interesting. We went to The Hague and we met a person who was working for a particular organisation from Sweden, and he's working particularly on DDR. My boss introduced me to this person and he was like, what is a young woman like you from Latin America doing here? Just very condescending. And she said, so it was this intersection between gender and age. I was not very happy with that attitude from his side. We began talking and he asked me some questions about DDRs and networking. And after he'd heard my answers and that I have experience in both the field and in research and that I have language skills for many languages, but I had to prove myself, she said. Afterwards, he said, oh, no, yeah, you have experience, so we can work on this. But it was just so frustrating to hear him being that way, right? Which is, I think, telling in itself. But then I really appreciated that she went on to reflect on the fact that he was not even a Swede. He was working for a Swedish organisation. He was from the United States. I was like, I could ask the same question for you, right? Like, what are persons like you doing here? So I have many kind of conversations like this with young people, and they emerge, let me tell you just a little bit about the project itself. So in 2019, I was fortunate to do, I guess, a pilot project that was particularly interested in talking to people who were directly involved in advocacy towards the first Youth, Peace and Security Resolution at the Security Council, which I'll talk about further in a bit. And then, as Caitlin said in the introduction, since 2020, I've had the great fortune and privilege to have an Australian Research Council DECRA fellowship that has allowed me sustained close engagement with a community of practitioners, researchers, bureaucrats, government officials, and so on, who work in and on around the youth, peace and security agenda. This has included a lot of time spent in Zoom meetings, often at very awkward times of the, I'd say day, but really night here in Australia. Both closed sessions, meetings, advocacy and planning, as well as public events, symposiums, trainings, and some high-level events. I've also done 47 interviews, 35 of them with young people, youth working in a role that identifies them as youth, and the remainder in practitioner youth serving roles. It was an online survey and now public database of documents. The project, usually a DECRA fellowship, is 3 years long. However, due to the global pandemic, personal circumstances, other factors, that plus the preceding pilot project has meant that I've been able to be involved in this community for 5 or 6 years now closely. I was following it before. And that's let me get to know those who work on and around the agenda, and building not only professional relationships, but friendships with both youth and adult practitioners in this space also. So for me, this relationship and relationality in the space draws on feminist approaches, including the work on feminist critical friendship, which resonates with me because I feel like the emergence of friendship alongside professional relationships, and as I said, this positioning that I think this work matters and that young people should be included, has also meant that this work is accountable not only to a scholarly audience, but to those practitioner friends. And given this is kind of the concluding reflections, I think it's very important to note that I wouldn't be able to do what I did without those relationships. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's given me small amounts of time, long amounts of time in equal measure. And to those individuals who, in the spirit of feminist critical friendship, have held me accountable as much as I do through my work as well. I very briefly also just want to note, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the youth space, when I talk about youth here, I tend to avoid age categorizations because they're problematic for a range of reasons, and there's a whole range of them. The Youth Peace and Security Agenda, which I'll talk about in a moment, defines youth as 18 to 29, but age ranges, go up into the 30s to 40 as well in terms of people identifying as youth. I asked everyone in the project whether they identified, at how old they were and whether they identified as a youth. So the self-identification for me was the important factor. But what I do want to note here also is that we're talking about people who are over 18. So we're talking about people who in their own contexts are legally adults, who in other realms of their life vote, can join the armed forces, can smoke, can drink, get married, etc. And so ideas about incapacity due to immaturity with the label of youth kind of come up against the fact that in other domains, the same governments and decision makers are happy for these people to be making what we would call adult decisions. So with that said, let me tell you just very briefly a little bit about the Youth Peace and Security Agenda to situate this conversation. So ideas, stereotypes about young people as passive or as potential dangers have been the kind of dominant frames that much policy as well as academic scholarship has kind of engaged young people over the preceding decades. In the kind of policy space, practitioner space, there was a significant shift in 2015 when the UN Security Council, its highest security body, unanimously passed Resolution 2250, which recognises, and I quote, the important and positive contribution of youth in efforts for the maintenance and promotion of international peace and security, which is the core mandate of the Security Council. And this articulation is groundbreaking in many ways because it is the first time that youth have been officially recognised and legitimised by the Security Council. And the United Network of Youth Peacebuilders the year before had actually done a little bit of research to find the language that had been previously used. So we can see this marked change in terms of the language that had previously been used to this. The resolution formalises requirements for governments and other stakeholders to not only support but to create mechanisms for young people's participation. And the resolution identifies 5 key pillars, which if you're familiar with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, you'll see the resonances as well. So participation, protection, prevention, partnerships, and very unsatisfyingly, not a P, disengagement and reintegration. Since 2015, there have been a lot of developments in this space. There have been 2 subsequent Security Council resolutions, one in 2018 and one in 2020. And beyond the UN, regional bodies have also adopted and picked up the agenda and its mandate. So EU, AU, ASEAN, and last year the League of Arab States has a plan as well. Again, and we'll see the echoes of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in many ways. The primary means of localising or implementing it has become national action plans, and we've seen there's now 7. There was 4 until about 6 months ago, and there's a kind of a real increase in adoption and use there. There have also been the creation of reports, of guidelines and of training, many of which you can find in my database. I mean, very much not enough funding and resourcing, but funding schemes and resourcing as well. There's also been a proliferation of youth-led and youth-partnered activities, including the establishment of national and regional coalitions that have been both youth-led and youth-partnered. the Civil Society Working Group on YPS, and the Global Coalition on YPS, which originated as an information sharing network within the UN in the early 2010s, and is now co-chaired by three representatives, one from the UN, housed in UNFPA, one from Youth Serving Civil Society, which is Search for Common Ground, and one from Youth-Led Civil Society, which is the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. The YPS agenda marks 10 years in December. However, youth peace work, of course, has been happening long before any formal institutional recognition. Skip the slide. So, youth leadership and participation in efforts at all levels, community, national, regional, international, has long been occurring and has long been well documented by youth practitioners and practitioner academics themselves, as well as scholars from all around the world, including many who are in this room and joining us online as well. From peace education, conflict resolution programs at very local levels, to advocacy towards district or federal governments, to the direct mediation between conflict parties, to the provision of emergency services and supplies in acute situations of violence. Youth are present in innumerable, often overlooked ways. These activities are also undertaken often in incredibly insecure contexts and at great personal risk to the young people themselves with limited or no resources. And a couple of years ago, the UN commissioned a report called If I Disappear, which is incredibly comprehensive documentation of the risks that young peacebuilders face. These activities have, as I said, been occurring long before the Security Council recognised youth leadership. And so for me, the question that emerges here is, what does it mean for ongoing youth peace work to encounter highly bureaucratised processes of international organisations, regional bodies, state governments? So it's this question, I guess, that underpins my interest in the agenda as a thing in the world, and connects it from my previous work kind of at those local levels to what it means to institutionalise these things. So the questions then that kind of have emerged and that animate this project at its heart are very simple. The first is, who has expertise on youth peace and security? But relatedly then, the question of who gets to decide who has expertise. So rather than just thinking about how experts come to be in the room, I'm interested in how they come to be there and the conditions under which that happens. At their heart, these questions are about power. They're about the ordering of relations and practices in the world. And asking these questions, I think, has particular relevance for those interested in what is commonly described as youth inclusive peace building. But I also think that it has relevance for how we as scholars might understand how expertise is established, contested and navigated by other constituencies that are marginal or excluded in global politics as well. Excuse me. So for youth who work on and around the YPS agenda, the existence of this agenda raised questions of how they position themselves as actors and how they were seen by others. And so fundamentally, this is how I get to expertise, right? How whether and how they had the authority, the legitimacy, the expertise to play a part in this space. This was not a binary, an either or, a given or not. This is constantly renegotiated, complex assertions of expertise. And they depend on different kinds of authority and the way in which that's recognised or not. And the spaces in which young people can do this exist in part because of the creation of this formal agenda, which changes the spaces, but also in part because of the peace work that youth themselves were doing, which, as I said, predates this work. So I have more stories, of course. So I'm going to tell you two more stories now to talk about and kind of highlight those complexities. So I was wrapping up a virtual interview with Zuma, which is a pseudonym she's chosen, a young woman from North Africa. about her work and her advocacy. She had founded a young women's rights organisation. She was involved in regional advocacy work, and she had opportunities to speak at high-level global events. Zuma was impressive by the metrics often get used. She spoke fluent English, which is one of 4 languages she spoke fluently. In addition to a bachelor's degree in her home country, she had a master's degree in conflict resolution from a UK university, and she held or had held international fellowships or affiliations with peacebuilding organisations, in Zuma's case in Germany and the US. She had also experienced conflict when she was young. She'd been forcibly displaced with her family. She'd lived as a refugee for several years and then had resettled and made a new home. So we talked a lot about the work she'd done. We talked about the opportunities and challenges of YPS. And as we were concluding our conversation, her email pinged in the background and she apologised and went, changed windows to shut it so it didn't interrupt us. And suddenly she returned to our conversation and she was laughing loudly. And she said, "How appropriate. It is yet another invitation for me to tell my sad story to diplomats. This is all they ever want me to do." And she used the air quotes for the sad story. For Zuma, despite this life of incredible achievements, recognised qualifications and awards, and the work of the youth-led peacebuilding organisation that she'd co-founded, she was being asked to speak, even if she could speak about those things, on the condition that she narrate the violence and displacement first that she had experienced. It was this experience that gave her expertise that was seen as legitimate by the institution extending the invitation and not the work that she'd been doing. She told me previously that she'd asked a different organisation when they'd invited her if she could not talk about herself, but instead share stories of success from the organisation. She'd been told no, they wanted to hear her story. They said, "This requirement to narrativize past trauma to participate in institutional fora was not unique to this conversation, but rather one I heard repeatedly across my interviews." The complexities then of what expertise is in this field are evident in many ways. And so let me share another story. So a 27-year-old young man held a role as an advisor on youth within the UN. And in conversations, he was talking about how his age and the role he held were sometimes confused. He said, "Sometimes I'm confused to be the youth representative, even though I just happen to be young. And I'm a specialist in this area, and I could, in theory, just as well have been 50. Sometimes I had a consultation with young people and they were like, 'Why is our youth representative at the UN a white guy?' And I had to clarify to them that, no, I'm just a bureaucrat. I'm a technical advisor. I'm not your representative. That's not my job, but I'm here to be an ally on the inside. I'm not representing you." So he identifies how his presence is misunderstood because of his age. And as just a bureaucrat, in his words, the expertise he brings to that encounter is technical advice and UN programming. He has institutional legitimacy that underpins his role. He is at 27 also a young person, but he can't claim that sense of grounded authenticity as a youth from the country in which he's working. So these stories tell the multiple ways in which young people navigate what their expertise looks like and how and when they're able to claim the space. It's not just young people, however, that tell stories about expertise. The UN resolutions, the 3 of them on YPS themselves, reveal this underlying tension as well. So here is selected text from each of the 3 resolutions. There's other instances in all 3 that illustrate what I'm about to show you. And you'll see that the language, I've covered a phrase that reappears across the resolutions on youth, peace and security. So if we go to the second one, just because it's short and I can read it out, it says, reiterates the importance of Security Council missions taking into account youth-related considerations, including through consultation with local and international youth groups. However, the language that exists in full in the resolution includes the phrase as appropriate. So this language appears in the YPS resolutions. A lot of the language in particularly 2250 actually is very has been taken from is very similar to 1325, to the Women, Peace and Security Resolution. And like an enormous nerd, I have them up on my wall where I've like matched them. So the sentences are literally the same, except swap women for youth, and the phrase "as appropriate" does not appear in the WPS resolutions. And what is interesting to me, and what I want to point here, is the question of who gets to decide when it is appropriate. Because if we're talking about who has expertise, who can participate as an expert in this space, it's not the young people saying, I'm ready. Well, they are saying that, but they don't get to participate because they claim the space. They're given it by someone who says it is now appropriate for you to participate. You will also note, I will also note, that the resolutions in other places, when they talk about the involvement of other kinds of actors, don't condition their participation. It's only when it's talking about youth participation. So then let me talk for a few slides about the kind of academic conceptual work that I'm doing here. And this is work that I'm bringing together in a manuscript for a book that comes out of this project as well. So the question I'm thinking about here is who gets to have expertise. So then what do I mean when I'm talking about expertise? So in the field of international relations, there's been a proliferation in recent years on this question, and it's a range up there, thinking about practice theory, thinking about epistemic communities, and thinking about feminist approaches in global governance as well. I also draw beyond international relations on the sociology of expertise literature, which emerges actually out of kind of business and management, but is beyond that now, to think about and emphasise the ways in which expertise is both relational and not unidirectional, that it goes two ways in terms of the recognition. And so drawing on that scholarship, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail, but just for now, to say that then I'm understanding the idea of expertise as something which is inherently political and contested, which is concerned primarily with accessing, containing and retaining power, and is the basis for claims to legitimate participation in governance practices. What I'm doing in terms of extending this work and this space is to think not only about how the role of experts and expertise enables authority, but to ask who in the first place can occupy those positions. So a lot of the work to date, particularly in IR, is concerned with actors who are already legible as legitimate political actors in politics. My question then is what happens when an actor who's not seen as being able to participate, as we've talked about the literature to date and even the conditionality of the resolution, is granted legitimacy by the dominant position to participate. And to do that work, to think about that tension, I am drawing on both the work of Pierre Bourdieu as well as feminist scholars to think about the space as a field of youth-oriented peace building. So let me briefly explain what I mean here. So the first thing I do, I'm a feminist scholar, I can't help it, is to ask the questions about where people are. So picking up and extending Cynthia Enlow's call to ask where are the women, my work asks where are the young people, the children and youth in the international, and what can we learn if we take the power relations that exist seriously and question them and unpack them. The work of many feminist scholars, particularly on women, peace and security, as well as the broader space of women and gender in peace and conflict, has been really helpful to me in thinking through these things. And I really like, among many other works, the insights that Laura Shepherd offers us when she's talking about gender and women, where she notes that the active participation of women in peace building changes the meaning of peace building itself. And we can, I think, talk about youth in these terms as well. So this question of then an attention to, an attunement to power and who's missing and those relations meets a more recent engagement with Pierre Bourdieu and his approaches. So I'm not going to go into all of them now. No one needs that much French political philosophy at this time of morning. But in particular, I want to point out the ideas of fields and capital in particular. So for Bourdieu, he understands a field as a social space that is constituted by the different positions actors take in relation to each other. The field itself is a struggle to hold the power to define what is at stake and therefore who can participate. So the field only exists in terms of the people who identify as belonging to it and the relations between them. And so in the spirit of diagrams, which is very much in the spirit of Bourdieu as well, here's a little very simplified diagram. So there's a broader peace-building field that exists that is beyond youth, that includes the broader activities that go on. And then there are a group of actors who within that field identify as working in some way on youth. And I say youth-oriented because I feel like that takes into account the variety of positions, those who feel like we should just consult and, you know, tokenize young people, that sounds rude, and those who are advocating for a much more radical kind of shift in terms of how young people participate. And what is important here in terms of the concept is that a youth-oriented peace-building field is larger than YPS as an agenda, that YPS has emerged within the context of this broader field, and its emergence and its engagement and the way actors are using it is changing the broader field, but also then sits within it. And we can tell more about YPS if we see it that way rather than it being the whole thing in itself. So that said, in the spirit of Bourdieu as well, some visualizations for you. You don't have to look in detail, but I just want to point out how I'm using the Bourdieusian ideas. So Bourdieu talks about capital, and fields are constituted by the struggle for power, which is capital in that field. And for me, the youth-oriented peace-building field consists of grounded or authenticity and institutional legitimacy, and actors who occupy spaces in the field navigate between those two forms of capital to take position. This is not static. Fields are constantly in flux. Here's kind of two snapshots from my thinking. And over time, then actors kind of change their relative position. And this, in Bourdieusian terms, is position taking. I'm not going to butcher the French by saying it. So the position taking that is engaged in as they claim one or both of these forms of capital, and as those forms of capital are recognised or not. So that's the, I guess, nerdy conceptual theoretical work for you. And I think the point, or what I'm hoping this does, is expand our way of thinking beyond kind of hierarchies to thinking about something that is a field where there can be different sites of power over it. It doesn't diminish the hegemonic role of organisations like the UN within it, but it lets us see where other sites might exist in the field where actors are engaging. So what I want to do in the short time I have remaining is to give you some examples of what this looks like from, again, the stories that people have shared with me. So the first, I guess, highlights particularly ways in which the expertise of youth is contested and is made contingent by others, so in terms of that recognition. And this is a quote from a young woman from Tunisia. So she says, something I really also discovered is the gap between international organisations and me as a local organisation. For the YPS report that we wrote it 3 times and it was deleted 3 times. We told them, this is our opinion, this is how we see youth should be engaging. Then experts who are 40 and 50 years old fixed this report for us. Of course they would say, what is this? No, this shouldn't happen. Actually, that made us so demotivated. You're telling us, tell us your opinion as young people on YPS and their engagement. Then you're telling me, no, an expert said it shouldn't happen this way. Okay, I see. I'm not an expert. I'm a young person. There's a gap between both languages. It's not only young people, though, who navigate this kind of tension and issue. And I want to be very careful in not homogenizing when we talk about institutions as a thing that do things, because obviously institutions don't do things, people do things, and they do them within the institutions as much as the institution acting in a certain way. And so I want to point out a few conversations that I had where people within the institution, whatever shape that might take, are struggling with the ways in which we recognise or not and engage young people in particular ways. So for one young man working within the system, he used the term trade-offs to describe the way in which, I don't know why they keep coming up, there we go, to describe the ways in which institutions think about engaging the agenda. He sees an opportunity for reframing this. And this is premised on the belief that youth actors should be engaged with as equals, or at least with more critical engagement than what he described as the kumbaya attitude that he sees in his work. So he says, okay, if we want to use this, being YPS, as a blueprint, we need to understand the trade-offs between what we've been doing traditionally and what it means to us and what it means organisationally. So this means having more difficult conversations about YPS instead of just adding youth to what we're doing, because adding youth to what we're already doing will not address the systematic challenges in what we're already doing. This is, as I said, echoed. A 30-year-old woman working for a UN body describes her work sometimes as heartbreaking because of her personal conviction for youth inclusion and the frustrations of encountering the inertia and not properly being able to prompt the action that she thinks the young people that she engages with deserve. She says, I'm really trying, but then I work for a bigger organisation who does not necessarily stand up for those issues and doesn't formulate an opinion. So how far can you go with it? It's always the political balance you have to strike between what I think would actually be good to advance the agenda and what's politically feasible. For her, navigating that political balance, she points out that for the YPS agenda, when you talk about organisation, implementation, it shouldn't be done without young people. But for the UN agency, as well as others, that request is, in her words, just actually extra money. It's extra stress that they have to do those consultations. So she's trying to navigate that, like how to bring them in ways that she thinks they should be recognised as experts versus the issues of the organisation. Time-wise, I've got 2 more slides. Okay, good. Finally, I just want to, as I said, keep our attention and focus on spaces that are beyond what we call YPS, beyond the agenda. Expertise exists and is recognised in ways that are not institutional consecration only. So there are other sites. So there's many examples. I had to just pick a few to put on the screen. These examples come from South Sudan, where young women talk about using mobile phones, using WhatsApp to create shared spaces, to check in. As she said, even though you're not close to me, you say you're my sister, we're sharing the same goals. So enabling that work outside of the structures. A young man in the DRC said that he's hopeful because there's intentional effort from a lot of young people that we've been talking to or engaging with to not give up. They do it in a way that is committed and very resilient. I feel that kind of work that is happening away from the spotlight is equally very important and often not given the credit it deserves. And a young woman from Southeast Asia noted that the pandemic itself made connecting easier. The YPS agenda and the fact that it exists over there for her has meant spaces were created where we met other youth from other countries, and now we connect and learn from each other and support our work. Beyond institutions and photo ops, we're doing the work on the ground, but we're connected everywhere. And I think that these ways in which young people connect and recognise each other's leadership and expertise exceed the formal space of YPS. And this work happens even if it's not quote unquote seen, asked by who, and relies on a different balance of capital that goes on in that field for the expertise to be recognised. So if we stay kind of zoomed out then, by way of concluding and thinking, a few reflections from here. I think it's important that we recognise that the youth, peace and security agenda is a policy framework, it's an institutional architecture, it is, in the words of one interviewee, a tool that he says we've used fairly well. The space for youth advocacy for peace, however, goes beyond these formal bounds. YPS is not the field itself, but a significant influence within it. And thinking about that then helps us think not only about who has expertise, but who gets to decide the conditions under which those expertise is recognised. The agenda itself also gains its legitimacy from the fact that youth were already leading this work. This work has been overlooked and identifying it explicitly, I think, is important for thinking through these things. And this year is the 10th anniversary of the agenda. So recent years, I think, have seen an ebbing of visible support. We've seen a deferral of the agenda at UN Security Council. And we've seen this narrow institutionalisation of the agenda largely through national action plans is where the energy is going. And lack of institutional commitments to the agenda is not unnoticed by youth. And so I think that we need to think about what that looks like going forward in terms of minimising, if not avoiding, the reciprocal relationships within the field. So to conclude, let me just end not with my words, but words of others. I think exploring the existence of a peace-building agenda dedicated to the quote-unquote inclusion of youth expands normative understandings of who can participate in peace-building. It also positions this kind of work as a case study to reveal broader insights into how expertise is legitimised and how the politics of who holds expertise in global peace governance is radically contested and contingent. Regardless of the existence of an agenda, this agenda, young people will continue to do the work they've always done. And this is very clear from two quotes. So Shadi Rushabaz, who's Iranian, says, YPS work will happen one way or another. And by YPS work, I mean both whatever we brand as YPS and whatever is non-branded. That is because you don't need an agenda to tell you you're not a violence perpetrator or a victim. She said, before I knew what YPS is, I was already working towards changing the narrative that blackwashes my country in such a great way. I really didn't need a Security Council resolution to tell me that I'm a positive agent of change for peace. And I want to end finally with a quote from a young woman from Yemen to point this out and to point to the work that needs to be done by institutions in terms of engaging this space and young people. She said, more of these young people are, including myself, are not afraid to really voice this. They look for opportunities to voice this and they don't rely on the same 5 channels. Coalitions are being made, groups are increasingly more visible, there's use of social media. So you're not just relying, and this is actually maybe a warning even for institutions, that young people are not just sitting, waiting. So, thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for a fabulous presentation of all the work that you've been doing over these years. I have so many questions and comments, as I always do, but actually, Helen has invited 2 international guests to sit in conversation with her work. And then in the final, so we will do that, and then in the final 30 minutes, I will open the floor to questions either from online or in the room. So let me introduce our 2 international guests to you. Siobhan McAvoy-Levy is the Director of the Desmond Tutu Peace Lab and Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Butler University. She's a scholar, activist and educator working at the intersections of critical peace studies, youth studies and critical constructivist international relations. We also have with us Prometo Rangadang, and he is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Office of Research Dissemination at Mindanao State University in the Philippines. His research explores peace-building, memory and youth agency in conflict-affected societies. So Siobhan and Prime will speak for about 2 to 3 minutes in response to Helen's work, and then I have a few questions for the 3 of them before we open it to questions from the audience. So, Prime, did you want to move over a little bit so you're in camera? Excellent. Who would like to go first? Prime first. I will give you a warning.
Okay.
Keep us on schedule.
I was charged now. Again, Helen, thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this conversation and for really inspiring us, me, to do this work, especially in youth engagement. Every time I prepared a presentation, a reflection, but when Helen is talking, I said, oh, Helen is already answering my reflection. So maybe this is some sort of, I hope, maybe a part of the things that you might want to include in this project, very exciting project. But if not, this might be some sort of my outline in the book review in the future. So, but really excited. So I will just highlight 3 things because the timer is starting, but really looking forward to talk more later on. Number 1 is that I travel 7 hours from Mindanao in the Philippines. And while Helen is reflecting and talking about YPS and mentioning about the United Nations, I reflect on the tall towers in New York. And while also reflecting of the youth and children in Tagulwan, in Misamis Oriental, and trying to reflect on how our conversation with the YPS reflect and cascades with those youth organizations, especially the informal ones in the margins. So this is really one thing that keeps on lingering in my mind, reflecting what's happening, people wearing, whatever, and this from the informal margins in the post-conflict communities. Number 2, I would like to reflect about relationships, and which Helen already talked a lot about. So like the intergenerational aspect of building relationship, and that yes, we talk about youth expertise to remain like being in the, being caped by those, those holding the notes of power and politics. But also, like, I want to reflect about that, what I term as the shared expertise, dialogue with my elders, maybe dialogue with youth who are younger than me, or dialogue, the shared expertise. How can we make sure that we're able to build this relationship in our effort to, acknowledge youth expertise? And the third one, 2 minutes, is about, I really like Helen when you talk about the other sides of power. I really love that because as what Shadi quoted, like, I don't wait for these institutions to recognize me. So it's really resonate to me a lot. And why do we insist ourselves to these institutions which might be keep on excluding us? So yeah, I really like to hear more and reflect more about these other sides of power, as you mentioned. That's all from me, and thank you very much.
15 seconds to go.
Well, thank you. Prime, you've covered a lot of that I wanted to talk about. And similarly, Helen answered all my questions. I have a lot of questions, and so I'm going to bulk some of them together. I know they're going to be answered in the book, and I would expect you to answer them now. But first of all, I want to congratulate you on this wonderful project and the way in which you framed it, the work that's gone into it, which has been an astonishing amount. And the critical lenses that you bring to it with this feminist critical friendship lens, which is really one of accountability, which models for all of us how we can do and should do these projects. And you're writing about power and how it's maneuvered and created through stories and storytelling and through demands for participation in decision-making by young people. And so the co-constitution of knowledge. And so a couple of things jump out at me. Zuma's story, for example, this way in which some of the participants are required to instrumentalize their own traumatic experiences and identities in order to be part of the conversation is concerning, even though we know that the lived experience of conflict is very important to get into these spaces. So I'm wondering several different things. Is there pushback against it? Or do some of the participants have regrets that they've allowed their stories to be used in this way? Are there other ways in which the grounded authenticity that you're writing about is appearing, or is it only grounded authenticity rooted in specific kinds of conflict experiences? Because our experiences of conflict can be very, very nuanced, multifaceted. So is poverty and form of violence, for example, in a conflict zone that stories are told about as gender-based violence, legitimate expertise related story. In this, I'm also thinking about what nuances may be being missed in the way that peace and peacebuilding are being constituted as concepts, as theories, and as methods. So maybe I'd love to hear about how you see this agenda having changed our understandings of what peace is, where peace happens, and what peace building is. What peace is itself. Because what I hear from it is often that it's bringing in the notion, it's normalizing the notion of young people as positive peace builders, but what kind of peace comes with that? And again, all these questions about who gets to decide, that is really a really fascinating question. And the second part of that I want to raise up, which I think is really important, is the tactical performativity of many of the participants in this studies. And who come into the process. Zuma's story suggests a kind of resignation, right? That she's got to tell. Here, I have to tell the story again in a recorded space. And often the performance by subaltern groups is done in such a way that it's a surreptitious play of power that can be misunderstood. So I'm wondering too, are there ways in which the people who are engaging, the adult stakeholders, recognize that there's tactical compliance going on here, the maneuvering that's taking place, and how are they accommodating and thinking through this, if they are thinking through this, ways in which they engage with young people. Lastly, and then I will wrap up, similar to what Prime raised, but I know there were fears, certainly at the beginning of the agenda, that this whole big focus on YPS would detract from the other kinds of youth and peace building work that's happening at the very local level, the micro local level. Have you found that to be true? That have your participants said that they or have less ability to get funding or to do the work they want to do because they aren't able to or don't want to fit into these YPS type groups? Thank you for your wonderful work. It's a pleasure to share.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I don't think I'm going to be able to respond to all of them, and I need another 40 minutes to do it. But I think I can answer a couple of them together. I think this observation around is there any one kind of, it's not your words, it's my bad words of yours, like grounded authenticity, or like what are we recognizing as legitimate there? And this question of is poverty or is an experience of gender violence that occurs in a conflict also a condition? And I was thinking when you were talking about this idea of the good youth, so the kind of young person who is allowed to participate. And I think that resonates with some of your other questions. It has a lot of dimensions, right? Because in these spaces, YPS spaces particularly, we're not inviting young people who fought for a revolutionary armed group, who still maybe holding the gun metaphorically, right? We're talking about peacemakers and peace builders who have particular kinds of experiences to be able to talk. And that narrows that, I think, in terms of what's being seen. At the same time, I think the space of what YPS is very fluid and contested. So this goes to your question of what peace is in it. And I think in some ways it kind of fixes it and makes it more brittle or something. But in other ways it almost comes to be anything and everything. If you put the label on it, it functions as YPS work. So I think like those things are simultaneously happening. And the work of people like Sugaraya and Tanik and Surak Kwan and things that kind of question this issue of securitization of an agenda. What happens when we're not just talking about the youth and peace agenda, but we're talking about the youth, peace and security agenda. And I mean, you have written and we have talked about that linking of peace and security and its effects, right, and how it changes what we think about as peace itself. But I think also simultaneously that both fixing and fluidity that happens at the same time means that your last question about these fears about what the agenda will do for youth peace work are both realised and avoided, often simultaneously. So I absolutely think in many ways it has narrowed the quote unquote kind of work that's being done, because there's not enough funding, right? Fund it, more resource and more, right? All those issues. I was joking in my interviews about how I should start a timer for when like funding and resourcing comes up as a challenge, like see how quickly it happens because everyone, but the funding that is available is framed in particular ways. So youth both change what they do to get it, but also I talk to many young people who are like, well, we can say we do CBE work if that's where the funding is, and we'll still just do the community dialogue, whatever we were doing before that was branded as peace building, you know. So I think that the simultaneous fix and fluidity, I think is a really interesting feature, which isn't to let the agenda and its institutional frameworks and processes off the hook, right, in terms of the effect that they are having on that space at the same time for young people's, you know, efforts within our tribe, which is where we both are interested in and advocate. It's, you know, insufficient, but there's some thoughts back to you.
Thank you. So what we thought we would do now is pull back a little bit to think about how Helen's work fits within the broader context of the work that Prime and Siobhan are doing. And for that, I have some questions. So Helen's work is a reminder that youth and their contributions are more than an institutionalised agenda. They were working before YPS and they continue to navigate outside the boundaries of YPS. So I wondered if, based on your own work, Prime and Siobhan and Helen, if you wanted to add some more reflections, what do you think this tells us about the longevity and utility of institutionalised agendas broadly, particularly where youth leadership is concerned?
Let me go first again.
Okay, sure. I think we all know that way before the YPS, a number of youth organizations, be it in a formal or informal ways, are already engaging in peace work, and that's already been recognized in the literature clear. So I think in terms of having the YPS, I would say that YPS should be a starting point, not a selling. So it should be something that will inspire more, but not really that it will be, not just to institutionalize things, but really like something that will inspire more for those in the margins. So that's what I am, really thinking. So looking back or reflecting back on the idea of how can we really cascade the influence of this highly international framework to those from the margins.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is that, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical, but, institutions exist to reproduce themselves. But unfortunately, when there's little funding or little political will to put funding towards specific, programs and institutions, for example, around youth, they'll tend to limp along, right? So I would see that YPS will probably continue, but it may be in that limping along type status that will increasingly frustrate young people who want to be part of that agenda and keep out people who may have vital, new and interesting things to say, and therefore then lead to a kind of reproduction of the same ideas recirculating. I think that's a danger that I would be looking at and concerned about. How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep bringing in new voices? How do you keep it away from groupthink? How do you really support youth peace builders who are actually on the ground doing the work to be invited into the space without having to jump through all these hoops of proving their authenticity, which can be re-traumatizing and very unfair?
I would just say it goes to both comments about when is YPS a distraction from the work, right? When is either advocating for it, trying to get access to things, trying to teach other young people, so much of the quote unquote sensitization about YPS is done by youth-led groups in their own context, right? Yeah, in the way that Prime's talking about, to let more people know that it's a thing so then they can be involved. And I just worry about the kind of diversion of very limited, as much as we talk about youth as energetic and enthusiastic, right? It's not boundless, it's limited. So where that work is going to, where it's most needed. And the frustration, really worried about the frustration. Being let down by the institution. again.
Yeah. So by centering expertise on youth builders, Helen's work challenges the persistent stereotypes about youth that still dominate institutional architecture. What stereotypes are prominent in the work that you do, and how do your interactions with youth peace builders through the research that you're doing challenge these stereotypes?
Me go first this time? Okay. Well, I've done work with young people in the US most recently, but also in Northern Ireland and with Israelis and Palestinians. I think the dominant stereotypes are that young people are either disinterested, apathetic, or they're dangerous and risky. And Helen has shown us how also there is this stereotype that they lack competency. Okay. All of these are contradictory because you can't be a danger if you're incompetent. Maybe you can. Well, yeah, certainly. Okay, never mind. Scratch that. So, I mean, these stereotypes, however, are not just held by adults about young people. They're held by young people about themselves. And they're reinforced over and over through our school systems, through the way we do research with them. So, if we're looking for something really important about the YPS agenda, is that it does, as you said earlier, Prime, inspire young people to think that perhaps there's a way in which my expertise, which I know that I have, or that I sense that I have, or that I don't know that I have, but I'm now starting to hear other people that believe that I have, so I can now embrace it, can help puncture the reproduction of stereotypical kind of thinking, which comes out of families, comes out of schools, comes out of churches, comes out of universities. It's not just coming out of discourse of institutions, right? It's complexly created. That answers.
Yeah.
I think the stereotype that I think remains is the mechanistic sense of inclusion. I think it remains. In a previous discussion, I think 3 years ago, Helen inviting me to talk about in a webinar, and I talk about the fish love. When young people are included, not because they are loved, but because they are needed. Like fish love. I love the fish, not because I want the fish to live, but because I want to eat the fish. The fish is dead. So fish love for my own benefit. So young people are here because we need them to fix the printer and the Wi-Fi is off, so we need them. So that's fantastic. And I think that really remains up to these days. And then I think that's really remains dominant. And so I hope more dialogue with the elders and other actors will hopefully address that stereotype.
Did you want to add anything
No.
further? Okay.
Except for how great fish love is.
So I wonder, I think this speaks to a broader idea about kind of where is youth expertise situated and kind of the challenges of silencing that expertise. So I wondered if to invite all three of you to reflect on the consequences of silencing youth expertise for the future of global governance and formalised peace processes. Did you want to?
I think it's indeed scary. The silencing will surely cut innovation and sustainability with the advent of very strong advent of the AI, something that we can reflect more on how the engagement of young people can really put more flavor to a better world that we live. So I think silencing is really a very dangerous way forward. So it weakens peace itself, and it really will surely broken the frameworks for sustainability for peace and development.
Yeah, I mean, I would be worried about the silencing of certain forms of expertise, of youth expertise. Some of the youth expertise is going to be elevated, but a lot of it is going to be silenced. And that's the silencing of youth who've been involved in violence, for example, but who are now interested in peacebuilding. Right? Do they still have credibility, and what kind of renunciating statements they have to make in order to be taken seriously? And, then do they do self-esteem credibility in their home communities, those kinds of things. The silencing of youth who are not, going to the top institutions of third level education in the world. We're not speaking four languages and not having all those accomplishments, which are amazing accomplishments, but there's so many youth out there who have thoughts on peace, lived experience of peace, conflict, violence. So there's a built-in silencing of young people who are out of school or who are not in university and never will be, but who are still youth and who contribute to all facets of society in conflict and after. And then there's the silencing that goes on around the way in which we define what is a conflict zone. Is it only in active war zones? Is it only in post-conflict situations? Is it only in the global south? Where do we see these pockets in the global north, and how can there be productive conversations across those kinds of different conflict war zones?
I would just add, and I think it goes back to your comment question before about the what kind of expertise. So Zuma can participate not only because she's done all those things, right, that we mark as entry, qualifications, right, but that she had this lived experience. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the, for Zuma, she doesn't want that to be the only reason, right? But as you say, I think it's very important that you shouldn't have to have all those things in order to be able to talk with expertise about your experience. And I think one of the particular features of institutionalizing youth inclusion in a certain way is that inclusion is a directional term to be included in something, and that is an unfamiliar context for young people, right? That only requires language skills or whatever, but requires that, the kind of the habitus, to use Bourdieu, right? Like the understanding of how the space works and the ability to stand up and deliver a presentation that is that makes sense, to tell a story in a way that the institution can hear it, right? Which might not be the way in which the young person would tell a story elsewhere. So I think about those kind of like the I don't want to say translation, I think that's quite right? But like that work has to go on, and the institutions don't have to do that work, right? They ask young people to come into that space and put it back, and that excludes people by definition. The other thing I would just note on that question of the dangers of silencing is, I guess, what we lose when we invest in these spaces rather than others. So I think YPS is, imperfect. It's, there's a lot of people working very hard. There are a lot of productive sites that have been enabled, right? This learned shared experience dialogue across generations kind of thing that perhaps wasn't happening before, but it also has foreclosed perhaps opportunities for other kinds of fora and spaces that kind of stuff can happen, again, because of the non-boundless energy that everyone has, the resources.
Right.
So I think one of the many things that's fabulous about Helen's work is that by focusing on the expertise of youth, Helen demonstrates that they are knowers with the authority to claim their experience. In your work, and again, Helen, invite you to add more reflections. How do you engage with young people's knowledge, and what are its implications for how their interests are acknowledged in the outcome of peace building? So I guess it's a two-part question. One about kind of method and approaches to engaging with young people in your work, and what are the implications of that for how we present their experiences?
Yeah, good question. Ready to go first?
Thank you, Suman. This is also connecting to the conversation recently that we had yesterday about the participatory.
Yeah, completely resonate with what Brian is saying. Work that I've been doing with young people has involved a variety of different methods that are oriented towards trying to create a space where young people are there from the very beginning of the research process, to the idea about what we're going to study related to peace, but also how we study it. And I think one of the things that's important for us to remember and that I learned through this process was that I might feel like young people will enjoy arts or photo voice, both of which I've used, or memoir writing related to pop culture, again, which I've used to explore young people's ideas about international relations. But that sometimes they also push back and say, we don't want those kinds of
that changes maybe the nature of what you're able to reveal. It's just us.
Well, I think it makes it, it makes the whole process slower. Takes a lot more time, a lot more commitment. It's a much slower, longer process between, coming together, building the relationships, building the trust, planning the work, implementing the work to the time when years later, when they are no longer youth, probably it gets published and maintaining that.
Yeah.
I mean, so how to do that authentically and in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're changing lives.
So I think what this reveals and kind of what is really key to Helen's work are some other tensions that exist within this space. Because I think whilst the work reveals that young people are knowers with authority, it also shows that there are significant challenges to how the institutions engage with that.
Yeah.
Because I think Helen's work illustrates the challenges young people face in defining the parameters of their own expertise, the push and pull that's associated with that within that global peace architecture. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little to how your work contributes to or reveals the spaces where youth continue to advocate to establish the boundaries of their work. And Helen wanted to add anything further to that?
Boundaries,
In terms of kind of what they understand their expertise to be and contribute to these peace spaces.
Yeah. It's really a beautiful question, Caitlin.
Thank you.
I think at least from my own experience, the sense of boundary is really very strong from at least from the Mindanaoan young people. Like, oh, this is me, this is my age. I am still young, so I need to set some sort of boundary, especially when engaging with my adults, especially engaging with those who are ahead of me. The Candas of Art and Speak really resonates, and like to what extent I'm allowed to share my thoughts, especially with there are other bigger superstar actors in the circle. So I think that is something that is part of the culture that's very vibrant up to this time.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I would see there are those boundaries that are both imposed by adult stakeholders, but reinforced by the ways in which young people are go through schooling or excluded from schooling. I was thinking though, about your question about boundaries, about the kind of artificial boundaries that we place between past, present, and future. How much we expect young people to, well, obviously there's that old trope, the young people are the future. That's why we're doing peace building for the future, for the young people, which excludes them from having knowledge in the present. But they also have knowledge of the past that often gets forgotten about. And that I think is really important to bring in. It's an important part of transitional justice, but it's also important to sort of think flexibly about knowledge as a kind of form of time traveling, right? That what we remember today, we'll forget next week, but then something else will come into view. And all of that is part of what we learned about peace as we grew up. So, it's cumulative, like layers of sediment, and in finding ways for young people to recognize those, that they can be boundary crossers across time and space.
You want to add anything? You? Did you have? Okay, I have many more questions always, but I thought what we would do, we have about 40 minutes left, so Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, I'm being told. Oops. So I thought I would open it up to questions either from online. I have some people here to read those out, or in the room.
All right. So here we have the first question from Isabella Queireza Gomez. It says, thank you all for the insightful presentation and discussion. I'm Isabella Gomez from Brazil, and I work as YPS team lead at Youth Transforming Narratives. My question is related to the intersection between youth and decolonization. How do you think the broader process of decolonizing global governance structures, particularly the peace and security agenda, could help ensure a genuine recognition of youth expertise?
Did you want to take a couple of questions?
So far we have two, so I can read the other
Sure.
one as well. And the second question is from Carlos Diaz, who says, warm greetings from Colombia. I would be very interested in hearing your insights on how to foster intergenerational engagement in the pursuit of peace. Colombia is currently navigating a period of profound turbulence amid an unprecedented effort to consolidate a stable and lasting peace. As in previous generations, young people remain disproportionately affected by violence, yet they continue to be insufficiently recognized as central actors in peace-building processes. In light of the persistence of transgenerational trauma and the reproduction of war narratives across generations, how might we advance reflections and develop tools aimed at a truly transgenerational approach to justice and sustainable peace led by youth?
We had a question in the room, if you wanted to add that.
We do these two and then Leslie, because I can't hold that many thoughts.
Of course.
Would you like me to go first? Thank you both, Isabella and Carlos. It's nice, the Latin American delegation on to be across the world with you in this conversation. I think the question of decolonizing is kind of global governance, peace practices, all of this thing is an enormous one, and also an incredibly important and timely one. I think that this what I'm thinking about in terms of expertise and how it's recognized and how the field is constructed, right? Like in that Borgesian term of the field is a site of struggles, right? Over what the field is. The increasingly loud conversations around decolonization, I think, are changing the nature of the field in having those conversations and pushing back on it, right? Rather than it just being an accepted thing that exists. Having said that, I think that there's this fundamental question of whether reform is possible, right, to these kinds of institutions. These questions of like the UN, which, you know, it literally was created, right, by the winners of a war, you know, like, I mean, that's a very cynical take, right, but it's baked into the structures. And so I think that there's this tension and this question of how do we reform something that is built to not recognize certain kinds of knowledges and certain kinds of people and certain kinds of, and that's not to say give up on it, because I think that it's, well, it's more than two-pronged, right? But there's work to push to make the institutions that we have now accountable. I'd say more accountable, but I think accountability as a base and then more accountable. And then also to recognize and support the work that goes on elsewhere and outside it. And that's really important to maintain that work that's going on in other places and sites. I also think that one of the things that I've seen in these conversations where this work is done successfully is when, and this goes in some way to Carlos's question, when there's true relationship building and trust building between people in different places. So youth outside the system, youth and their allies within the systems, right, who are working together. I think you can't do it. It sounds really naff. You can't do it alone, right? But like the spaces in which those people are working together to push back and to create opportunities and open up spaces for those who may have been excluded. You know, like all of that work is really important. And I think that this question, that kind of goes to a brief reflection on Carlos's question, which is also incredibly important. And I think Colombia has fallen perhaps out of our thoughts. We had a peace process, it's all fine, you know, like Colombia's on the path to peace. And obviously there's incredibly challenging circumstances that are going on there now. And I think that, again, it's about relationships and work across difference. And I have a fabulous former PhD student, now Dr. Ingrid, who's reading your questions for you, whose own work on what does it mean to actually engage in intergenerational dialogue and to build activist and advocacy coalitions that are built on those kinds of processes. That kind of work, I think it can be really helpful. But I also think it's about supporting that work that's happening and not trusting that the institutional processes are sufficient, right? And that is for us outside the country as much as those within any of these countries, right? To support and advocate and raise the profile of that work that has been going on, with the asterisks, of course, that sometimes raising that profile is risky, you know, so you have to think about that work, but broadly, right, as an approach. Neither of those are sufficient answers, but I think they're my thoughts in response to both answers.
Thank you. Siobhan or Prime, would either of you like to?
I mean, the only thing I would add, which I totally agree with what Helen has said, is that, you know, decolonization isn't a gift that anyone gives to you, right? Only the colonized can decolonize themselves, at least from my perspective. And we can, as people who walk alongside that process, support by trying to do the decolonization of knowledges that Helen's been talking about. And that has to happen intergenerationally, and that segregation in any form is a barrier to decolonization. And so age-based segregation is the barrier to that happening.
Leslie.
Reflection. I had so many questions, but a lot of people have already asked them, so it's great. Oh, don't look at me closely. I just was interested to pick up on one thing that you pointed out in the resolutions themselves, because it's one thing that we haven't come back to in that language. And I think we've been talking about all these other important questions. But I thought it was really interesting how you identified and pointed out how there was this real overlap in the YPS agenda resolutions compared to the WPS, for example, but then made this distinction of this different, where there was this little difference that emerged on the language with as appropriate, which for good reason you're thinking about critically. But I was also curious of, did you identify in kind of your process tracing of this evolution, how or why that came about in terms of the negotiations, who was having those discussions, who had input on that? And I wondered, feeding on some of these discussions and others I've had recently with some ECRs, have you encountered young people working in this space who have given some reasons, may they be contextual, cultural, et cetera, of instances in which they think things would not be appropriate for them to be doing these things? How have they spoken directly to that, the various reasons for it? How have you engaged with that?
They're both super great questions. In terms of the how did that language, why did as appropriate appear, I don't have like a direct answer to, you know, this member state said it has to be in there or not. But I know that what is very interesting about the YPS, the first resolution, 2250, is that unusually for a Security Council resolution, it also picks up a lot of the language of the Amman Youth Declaration on YPS. So 2250 is December 2015. In August 2015, the UN, the Kingdom of Jordan and other stakeholders organised a big event and the output of that was ostensibly a youth declaration, although obviously the politics of writing that is more complicated, but it's very much written as we the youth want these things. And while some of those things have fallen out, 2250 does actually pick up directly that language. And as I said, I was an enormous nerd. Not only do I have 1325 and 2250 on my wall, but I have the Amman Declaration with little lines. So I was trying to figure out where it comes from. So on one hand, they've picked up what is quite active, right? Language about young people owning the space and wanting things, and on the other there's this conditionality. And my hypothesis, which would be unsubstantiated at this point beyond broader conversations, is that as always it's a compromise, and there would have been people in the room who felt scared by, you know, I don't have the words in my head, like frightened of how active the language was that was being introduced, and this was a way to kind of to moderate it in some way, while others in the room were pushing for it. And I think things like UN resolutions are not, they're not declarations, right? They're not some enormous political statement of how great we are. They're political documents that are meant to tell largely member states what they should be doing, right? So in terms of like the intent of the document, I think is interesting in that as well. Your question about whether there are examples about when young people said they didn't feel like it was appropriate for them to participate is super interesting, because now I'm trying to think about whether that's the case, and I'd have to go back and kind of look and think, and I will. I think it's a great question. What comes to mind more immediately, rather than young people saying it's not appropriate, it's that they don't feel able to. So they either a fundamental questioning of their own expertise, like I don't know enough, or, you know, I'm not an expert or whatever, or a kind of a discomfort or an uncertainty about how to participate. So even if it was appropriate, like that question. And I wonder how much of that is to Siobhan's point about the stereotypes that are internalized, right? I don't have the capacity, or lacking the particular knowledge of the practices to be able to talk in those spaces. And I think that's where we see young people say that I don't feel like I can or should participate. But I'm definitely going to go back and think through more about whether there were times where they said, you know, that's not something, because most of the conversations are the opposite, right? I don't only want to talk about youth things. I want to be the youth person in the room talking about migration, talking about conflict-related sexual violence, talking about humanitarian, you know, like it's just another perspective on topics that are all topics that impact youth, rather than this like little collection of issues that are youth issues, right? So anyway, I'm going to go look now. My brain's thinking.
So I think all that leaves me to do is to thank our fabulous reflections people, and to thank Helen for presenting her truly wonderful work. Listen to you talk forever on this stuff.
Please don't.
And to thank our audiences for attending both in the room and online.
Being in conversation with me. I appreciate it so much. And thank you very much.
Very inspiring.
No, you're right. Thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah.
I could have.
Yes.